Problem is liberalism. It's this belief that we're all interchangeable blank slates, that the economic disparities and differences in education and the pure happenstance of geography are the only thing that tears us apart. So all we need to do is take every man from Mogadishu, drop him in Manchester, give him social housing, give him a few classes on women's consent, and he'll be as British as you and me. It just fundamentally doesn't work.
So you've been in some arguments recently with the headmaster of Michaela School in London. This is a very diverse school that has been touted as a great example of kind of schooling. Obviously the outcome of her results are very good for her students. She's been described as Britain's strictest headmistress, and the policies that she's instigated have been very popular on the right, introducing vegetarianism in the canteen, preventing kids from speaking to each other as they're walking to their lessons, basically being very, very strict, and what she describes as, I suppose, being inclusive, but also promoting a kind of British values as she sees them. What's wrong with this system? Why have you criticised it?
So I will say, interpersonally, Catherine and I have been very cordial when we're trying to set up a discussion in the near future, because conversation is always the best thing to work these out. I take umbrage with this because it is cited by the older establishment conservatives who I think are quite out of touch with the facts on the ground of how demographics have potentially irreparably changed British culture if something's not done about it. And they seem to think that well-funded civics programs are sufficient to integrate millions of recent arrivals who either have no inclination or no desire to bend their culture to the British way of life. And I first became aware of the Michaela School in ARC in 2023 when Catherine Birbalsingh was invited to speak. And she said a phrase that made my rather large ears prick up, which was, these are the sacrifices we have to make multiculturalism work. Now, as far as I'm concerned, in every election since 1974 and the Brexit referendum, the British public have voted to repudiate the doctrine of multiculturalism. It has failed. Multiculturalism in practice ends up being what Eric Kaufmann has analogized in White Shift as the entire world hosting the World Fair in your country, but your culture doesn't get to have a booth. Instead, you've just got to shut up and accept the fact that you're hosting the fair. Be grateful that they've decided to come here in the first place and enrich you. And so when Catherine says multiculturalism, what I think she means is compartmentalising people's deeply held religious and cultural convictions to being nothing more than a costume and some food options on a buffet. Because, as you mentioned, she enforces vegetarianism, silence in the corridors, and when a series of Muslim families decided to take her to court because she banned prayer, because spontaneously, of their own accord, Muslim students started praying in the playground, she said, right, no prayer at all. We're going to have a secular school. And Kemi Badenoch at ARC in 2025 got up and said, these are the kind of measures we need to make muscular, secular liberalism work. Now, I know the Church of England might not be aware of this, but Britain is still a Christian country. It has been a Christian country since its inception. I know you've spoken recently about Alfred the Great. When he wrote his Doom book, he based all of those laws on the life of Moses. He wrote the exact number of laws for the years that Moses was alive. He based it on Mosaic law. We've had an established church longer than we've had a proper Kingdom of England, or at least the Great British Isles, as a unified entity. And so the idea that we should sacrifice our Christianity, the sort of givens upon which our wonderful, low enforcement, high trust culture, the spontaneous arisen rests, I'm just not content with that. But what it does show is that for diversity to work, and what diversity means is ethnic heterogeneity, it is announced as a strength by everyone from Michael Gove to Keir Starmer. For diversity to work, it requires top-down control. It requires a state that acts kind of like a headmistress. And excuse me if I think that not only is this not going to work, is not only the idea that, as Robert Toombs said at the Now in England conference, girls in hijabs reading Kipling is enough to make them English, but also I don't want to live in a top-down totalitarian style state just to make multiculturalism work. I think if anything has to give way, it's not the English way of life, it's diversity and multiculturalism.
So obviously some of these policies she's instigated, we should explain for viewers who don't understand. So the vegetarianism thing, that's because certain religions don't eat certain type of meats. So therefore even English kids, white English kids, have to be vegetarian because we have to be inclusive of all of these different ideas. But also, you know, the Michaela School promotes the monarch promotes the British flag, is openly, overtly patriotic. So do you not think that there has to be some concessions, I suppose, to, there's millions of people here who now have different values and beliefs and different religions and so on in the UK. So we should, be inclusive of everyone, and we all have to make it work.
I think Catherine Birbalsingh, and this is why I don't have anything against her personally, is picking up the pieces of a fragmented culture and trying to do her best. And fair enough, she should be lauded for that effort. But the government should never have placed Britain in the place it is in the first place to necessitate the Michaela School. The Michaela School is essentially an imperial project. It's the kind of school you would set up overseas in British-controlled India to craft their civil service in the mould of the British government, rather than trying to create the sons and daughters of immigrants into, I hesitate to say cosplaying Brits, but it kind of is. And also, I just don't think it's going to work. I don't think we can compartmentalise people's deeply held religious convictions by layering over the top of it a British identity which, according to everyone that has espoused it, I mentioned Michael Gove earlier, during his tenure at the Department of Education, he came up with this famous 5 fingers of British values, and it was like democracy, the rule of law, all of these things that you would find in any other Western democratic nation, any other Anglosphere nation, nothing particular to the British. There might be British innovations, but that abiding by them does not make one British. And so the idea that you're going to layer that on top of completely different cultural backgrounds, and that somehow a few years at something like the Michaela School will have more influence on a child than their instructions at home, I just don't buy that. I'll come back to the example of girls in hijabs wearing Kipling, yet again, reading Kipling. A hijab in Islamic doctrine says that if a woman does not cover up and dress modestly by their standards, she's basically inviting sexual assault upon her. Now that is a completely different way to how we in England think about our women and girls. Like, women, to a lesser degree than men, but for centuries, under common law, could own property. According to the biblical tradition, women have equal moral dignity. That does not mean they're indistinguishable from men, as the trans lobby would like to say, but it does mean that we owe bonds of mutual consideration to one another. Islam doesn't think the same way. And so just by reading a bit of Rudyard Kipling, you don't repeal that practice in those children's minds, especially if they're dressing in a way which communicates they still buy into that ethos. So not only is it a shame that something like Michaela School seems necessary and is not desirable, I don't think in the long term it's going to work. And I think even if every single children of immigrants went to the Michaela School, you would still, by virtue of demographics, render Britain culturally unrecognisable.
What about the argument that these people are here now and you can't get into their brains and make them British and sort of force them to remove their Islamic views or whatever view that you're not happy with? And we have to come to some kind of accommodation with these people. So unless you're going through, I don't know, Chinese-style Uyghur camps where you're trying to re-indoctrinate them into some kind of different view in life, which I know that you're not advocating.
Yes.
How can we solve this solution, I suppose, is my question, when so many people are already here?
The great mistake of the likes of David Cameron and Angela Merkel declaring multiculturalism to have failed is they then thought that a sufficiently muscular liberalism was the answer. The problem is liberalism. It's this belief that we're all interchangeable blank slates, that the economic disparities and differences in education and the pure happenstance of geography are the only thing that tears us apart. So all we need to do is take every man from Mogadishu, drop him in Manchester, give him social housing, give him a few classes on women's consent, and he'll be as British as you and me. It just fundamentally doesn't work. So instead, rather than have this accommodating form of liberalism and redefine British identity to be one of values that presumably everyone can agree with, even though they're all very particular values, the reason the word British is there is because the values have to come from a people who invented them in the first place, to whom they're more natural, second nature. Instead of that, we should just reassert our traditional English Christian identity, and if people don't like that, they can move elsewhere. Like, we shouldn't be accommodating traditions that hate us. We shouldn't be subsidising the stay of people, for example, 33% of Pakistani and Bangladeshi families who have never worked in their lives. Why are we paying them to be here? If you cannot pay your own way, if you do not to feel, as when in Rome, to do as the Romans do, or as in England, to do as the English do, if you do not want to form relationships with the people of these isles where you are seen as polite house guests to the extent of where you maybe become one of the members of the national family, we never be confused about you being English ethnically, that's an ethnic category, but a friend, a house guest, if you don't want to do any of that, it's fine, there's plenty of other countries around the world you can go and live in, and I'm all for you moving there.
you're all for that, but what's the policy solution? I mean, you can't, or maybe you can, I don't know. Can you force these people to leave? Is that your plan? Or, I mean, can you encourage them to leave? Is that essentially what you're advocating for?
I think that if you prescribe the Muslim Brotherhood, for example, if you defunded all of these diversity, equity and inclusion charities that are basically race grifting front groups, as are given money by the government thanks to the Charities Act 2011, if you abolish all of the DEI hiring policies, if you dismantle the two-tier civilization and you instead assert the identity that we had before we decided that because Hitler invaded Poland and we defeated him, we're somehow indistinguishable from Hitler, so we should keep beating ourselves over the head with centuries-long white guilt, and so we should dissolve our own identity to accept anyone from everywhere. If we had our identity back before that, we would not only organically repel the people that want to transform it by giving them no quarter to do so, but also the handful of good-natured people from around the world who, fall in love with an English man and woman, actually build friendships and relationships with people in this country that we would want to keep here. We'd get the pipe dream of assimilation that lots and lots of politicians actually talk about but have no plan for. I mean, in return to people who say, okay, how are you going to do that? I would say the alternative is, okay, they haven't integrated, so what? What happens then? Because if you have no answer for that question, then what? Do we just throw up our hands and forfeit our culture and just say, well, we had a good run, guys. I guess through sheer demographic volume, it's winner takes all now. I'm not content with that.
You're talking about people's religious views, their values, you talk about people who hate Britain and so on. How does one distinguish someone who hates Britain or is a fundamentalist Islamist or something? I mean, could you give them a test and say, these are the questions, do you like Britain? Yes, no? I mean, they could easily lie, couldn't they? So how do you kind of distinguish the people that you're talking about in terms of, encouraging them to leave or whatever you want to do with them?
The distinction between Islam and Islamist, I mean, I would just have to ask, was Muhammad an Islamist? So the problem you have with Islam on the whole, and this is something that very few people are courageous enough to talk about, not least because they fear violent reprisal, but it's, if you're going to import millions of Muslims into this country, your hope is that they don't read their own text too closely, because they do not share the belief in universal innocent human dignity as Christians do. They have this concept called asabaya. It's found in the Quran and Hadith. It basically means clannish loyalty, and that means that you can lie, cheat and steal so long as it advantages your family, your extended clan, your religion, or the ummah, which is the idea that all Muslims are one race, which is why Islamophobia has been defined as a kind of racism. We're actually implementing, if Angela Rayner is going off the all-party parliamentary group definition of Islamophobia for her new working group, she would be implementing the Islamic view of race into British law. Sharia law has a completely parallel understanding of, again, human worth than common law and Christianity does. The best example to set this up is that Christ obviously said, do not judge lest you shall be judged, and caused the the adulteress who was going to be stoned by the crowd, spared her life. Muhammad, when he migrated from Mecca to Medina, the first thing he did when he was rejected by the Jewish tribes already there, who said, well, you're not the Messiah, he reinstated the penalty of stoning for apostasy and adultery. So completely different traditions on separate tracks that, if they're brought together, they're not going to meld into one train, they're going to be in a collision course. So I just have to say, you just don't admit parallel religions to have any holding over your political system. You, just like if Israel were to stop being majority Jewish, they would see that as a existential threat to the continuity of the country. Okay, if England stops being majority English, and we can recultivate, Christian feeling and a loss of tradition in those people, it's much easier than instilling in a whole new people. But if we were to become a minority, then of course that would be an existential threat to the future of England. So our policy should be generated around, our migration policy, our culture policy should be generated around, we're going to be an unquestioned majority. Christianity is going to continue to be the religion of our isles, and we're not going to accommodate people who would like to see common law replaced with Sharia law or Christianity replaced with Islam.
So kind of muscular nationalism rather than muscular liberalism maybe is a good way of describing it. You're obviously very interested in Islam and the problems that Islam brings into Britain, but some may argue, it's not just about Islam, but actually millions of migrants have come from third world countries which are not Islamic and bring equal benefits and negatives. So what do you make of this point of just talking about Islam perhaps limits you slightly?
No, I agree in the same way that just talking about illegal migration is often a smokescreen for the problems with legal migration. I mean, 95% of all the visas every year that we've given out since the Boris wave have been net tax detriments, and that 5% that are likely net tax contributors, according to the OBR, is still questionable. So it's been just unending economic penalty, but also cultural penalty, because, yet again, second-generation immigrants repeat the behavioural, economic, and often criminal patterns of their parents, and so you're not just importing people that will conform to self-interest and economic interests. Instead, you're importing the standard bearers of another civilization that are recreating the conditions of their homeworld in your homeland. And so the best sort of example of how we're just worlds apart is in Alan McFarlane's Origins of Individualism, English Individualism. And that is that even things as small as English households in the peasant economy had one household member own the property and it passed down to the firstborn son rather than the family as a collective. Completely different to Eastern Europe, where the family as a collective would inherit the property. If the dad wasn't earning enough, they could vote out the head of the household, which is why the communist system of informing on your own family members to get an extra room in the house mapped on so sadly but so well to a lot of Eastern European countries. If we are that different on the level of family structure, on the level of property ownership, to our close cousins in Europe, imagine how far apart we are from Asia, Africa, the Middle East, etc. And the final point I make, this is something that some even conservative politicians, and Rupert Lowe has been courageous enough to raise in Parliament. You cannot British values your way around high levels of first cousin marriage, because it entrenches that clannishness, that ideology that you only do what is moral insofar as it advantages your family and yourself across generations. And when you have multiple countries, whether it's Islamic countries like Pakistan or even in India, where you have cousin marriage rates of 40 to 60%, I'm not content to just bring all those people over to Britain and then try to tell them not to do that and hope it works out.
I want to ask about the Online Safety Act. This is an act which is meant to protect children. That's what the British government are arguing, against child pornography and just seeing terrible things on the internet. And according to the Labour government, if you oppose the Online Safety Act, you are on the side of Jimmy Savile. That's one of their ministers said that recently about Nigel Farage. So, Conor, are you on the side of Jimmy Savile on this issue?
No, decidedly not. I don't think anyone in the British public is on the side of Jimmy Savile. I would suggest it was a bad idea for Keir Starmer, according to the Telegraph, to have approved that line of attack by Peter Kyle, considering he presided over the Crown Prosecution Service when lawyers there failed to prosecute Jimmy Savile at the time. So I think that's a particular weakness for Keir Starmer. As far as the Online Safety Act, first of all, this argument that it's just to protect children, okay, I would believe you if, one, you did a single item line bill, as Miriam Cates was actually arguing at the time, despite her supporting this, to just require age verification for porn sites. Because we know that porn companies have preyed on children for years. They factor in children watching their content to their profit line, and it's just another piece of legislation atop the Malicious Communications Act, the Communications Act 2003, the Public Order Act, which was then bolstered by the Conservatives and then implemented buffer zones around abortion facilities, that leads to the arrest of over 12,000 people a year for speech violations. All this is think of the children while we persecute our political opponents. And so it needs to be repealed by the next government that gets in.
Are you worried about being censored yourself? As I know you're a commentator, you like to talk about a lot of controversial issues. You've done so in this interview. Are you concerned about becoming the next Lucy Connolly, or having your tweets censored and things like that?
So I was nearly arrested in 2022 outside a Conservative Party conference because a police officer overheard a conversation I was having with a journalist, misheard the context, and accused me of insulting the woman's sexuality. She was heterosexual, so a bit awkward. And he said if I asked a question about why he was threatening me with the arrest for the Public Order Act, he would then arrest me. It's on camera, the complaint went nowhere, of course it did. As far as the future, no. So I've worked in the last year quite closely with Ayan Hirsi Ali, and if she can continue fighting for what she believes in, for her children's future, who themselves are half British, if she can continue calling out the existential threat posed to the West by Islam with a fatwa on her head for the last 15 years, then I don't think I have any excuse. And so I just got married in the last month or so. We're going to try for kids hopefully next year, God willing. if this country succumbs to the predictions that the likes of David Betts and Dominic Cummings have made, which is civil strife along ethnic lines with a state that isn't interested in the political off-ramp, can I look my future son or daughter in the eye and say I didn't do all I could? I don't think I could. So I guess we just have to run the risk.
It's like that World War I poster. I think this chair is very similar to the chair that he was sitting in. It says, Daddy, what do you do in the war? Maybe Daddy, what do you do in the Civil War? Let's hope it doesn't get there. Obviously, do you think we're sort of approaching that though? I mean, if you look at the film Children of Men, I don't know if you've watched that, but it basically shows a dystopian Britain in around, I think, the 2030s. And the premise of the film is very left-wing. It's about Britain becoming a kind of anti-immigrant island. But you should watch it because it kind of gives you an idea of contemporary Britain. It actually looks very similar, and there's all sorts of terrorist attacks and things like that. So do you think we're heading in that direction? Are you concerned about that?
A little while ago, I reported for Courage Media on some intel that was swirling around chatter with people that know about this sort of stuff. And they said, look, we've been warning the British government for ages that there's thousands of jihadists in this country. The last time the MI5 numbers were released, it was about 39,000 jihadists. They said that they have 30,000 named jihadists that they're looking at the moment. And they're terrified that in the next few months to few years, all they need are a few Molotov cocktails and a few machetes, which every drill rap gang seems to have access to these days, to just cause havoc. And the British state not only is seemingly not interested in preventing this problem by doing the kinds of measures that we were talking about earlier, or at least drawing up the drawbridge and not letting any more potential terrorists in, or deporting the ones that are already here. Not only is the government not interested in doing that, they are confiscating our ability to raise our concerns and ignoring our concerns anytime we conduct a democratic vote on them by setting up new police units with the Home Office to monitor anti-migrant sentiment, or to say that any criticism of Islam is also somehow anti-Semitic, which is trying to throw up, again, that smokescreen of calling your opponents Nazis. So I put a lot of stock in the predictions by more credentialed people than I, again, Dominic Cummings and David Betts, who are afraid that our elites are so clod-eared that they're casting such ideological spells over themselves to maintain the illusion that they still control the country with a depleted army and police force, that they're so delusional they either can't stop it or don't want to stop it. And so I am worried it's going to come to fruition. I would just say there's still time. Conduct the measures to prevent this from happening. Listen to the people who are overwhelmingly sensible and are peacefully protesting across the country to keep their kids safe, and take the off-ramp.
How do you respond to this concern over the far right?
Well, only one of us got attacked by Hope Not Hate for a Liz Truss interview, Stephen. So that was when I got accused. As far as the far right, I mean, define it, because successive governments in the civil service have been incapable of properly doing so. We saw a little while ago, as I reported on, the US State Department expressing concern that PREVENT, the government's so-called anti-extremism program, which has time and again missed out on monitoring Islamic extremists like Abi Harbi Ali, or even recently Axel Rudakabana. They defined cultural nationalism, the belief that your culture and country could come under threat from mass migration and alien cultures that mean it harm, as a form of right-wing terrorism. Dame Sarah Khan, the former counter-extremism advisor employed at the Home Office since about 2005, who helped Michael Gove co-write his extremism definition in 2024, just did a paper with Hope Not Hate in December, saying that narratives about asylum seekers, calling them fighting-age males, is itself right-wing racism and a conspiracy theory. Yes, we both reported on those Riku leaks that were then retelegraphed around in January, that said that the grooming gangs is a grievance narrative exploited by right-wing extremists. So what they're describing as far-right is not phantom, non-existent groups like the EDL. It's not Combat 18 or Patriotic Alternative, which have already been infiltrated by undercover members, whether it's journalists or the police. So they're already riddled with Home Office plants in the first place. What they're calling far-right are concerned parents and members of the public raising reasonable, well-evidenced objections to a program of mass immigration, multicultural appeasement, and Islamic extremism that they have never voted against time and time again, and had their tax money spent any time that an Islamic extremist walks into a pop concert and detonates a nail bomb, have had their money spent on being told to don't look back in anger. Because that's what RICU exists to do, the Research, Information and Communications Unit. It's the government's gaslighting unit, so that any time an Islamic terror attack happens, they'll bus an imam out to the site, take some photographs, and tell everyone, don't blame Islam and immigration for this, so we cannot learn the lessons to prevent it from happening again.